Basically, what we found, honestly, is a whole lot of nothing. You should train to failure or close to it basically all the time, and then let frequency fall into place after. What is the return on investment from each additional set that I'm going to get?
All right, so I want to kick things off talking about training frequency. You have mentioned you train hamstrings once a week, but you do lateral raises 4 times a week. You've mentioned that the goal is to maximize the quality sets that are occurring over a pretty long period. Can you talk through your position on frequency from a hypertrophy standpoint in as much detail as possible?
Ooh, that's a good question. I could tell you did your background research. That's impressive. Um, yeah, I think frequency is kind of an elusive topic for a lot of folks, and it's a very interesting one because when you think about muscle growth, kind of the natural thought process is okay. We're going to stimulate the muscle in some way, kind of tell it to respond in terms of a hypertrophic adaptation. We're going to apply a stimulus that's going to come with some degree of fatigue, and that process of accruing new tissue or building muscle, to put it more simply, takes some time, right? Inevitably, that process ends, the fatigue has dissipated. So the thinking is, okay, at that point, you're ready to rock and you can do another session. You can train that muscle again. And I think there's kind of been swings back and forth in terms of what makes the most sense in theory in terms of the number of times per week you train a given muscle. So way back in the day, it might have been that you need a whole week to recover if you train a muscle really hard, and that muscle might be growing for that entire week period. I think maybe in like the 2010s, 20 teens, something like that. Um, there might have been kind of a shift in the other direction where it's like, actually, it seems that the muscle protein synthetic response lasts 24 to 72 hours, right? So, in other words, that hypertrophic response seems to only last 1 to 3 days. So, therefore, we should train with higher frequencies. And in fact, maybe we should even train a muscle every day or every 2 days, right?
Mhm.
And again, that pendulum has kind of swung back and forth over time. So we recently published, or I should say pre-printed, it's in the process of being published right now. We recently pre-printed a meta-analysis where we said, okay, if we were to just control for every variable we can in a training program and just look at the effects of frequency, so the number of times per week the measured muscle is trained, what are the effects, right? Do higher frequencies lead to greater muscle growth? Do lower frequencies lead to greater muscle growth? Maybe there's some sort of inverted U effect where there is a benefit of higher frequency up to a point, but then it's actually worse, right? So anything's on the table. Any sort of relationship is on the table. And basically, what we found, honestly, is a whole lot of nothing, right? You could maybe squint and say that going from a frequency of 1 time per week to a frequency of 2 times per week does increase your muscle hypertrophy, but that effect was really, really small. And then beyond 2 times per week, it wasn't worse, but it also wasn't clearly better. Now, again, it's important to keep in mind that that analysis was with everything else controlled for, right? So, how close to failure the sets were, and also the total number of sets in the training week. And that's a really important one because in practice, oftentimes, if you're training a muscle 2 or 3 times a week instead of just 1 time per week, that's also going to increase the total volume that you're going to do,
For sure.
right? So, again, it's important to keep in mind that while I can't sit here and say, with my scientist hat on, I can't sit here and say that frequency doesn't have an effect on muscle growth. That is when the total volume is equated, right? So when I give you a given number of volume in a week to complete, it doesn't really matter, or it doesn't seem to matter all that much from the research we do have, whether it's done in 1 session, 2 sessions, 3 sessions, 4 sessions, etc. I think there are some practical considerations here. So, like you mentioned, I like to train my hamstrings about 1 time per week. I've played around with training it with higher frequencies, kind of playing around with all the different variables, and I just keep returning to training them hard once a week. I'm a taller guy, so when I do like Romanian deadlifts, for example, it's a pretty long range of motion. My hamstrings get under a really deep stretch, and I just get sore for a while. And one option is to train less hard, to try to minimize that soreness and try to kind of get fancy with it. But I just keep returning to training them hard once a week, getting all my volume in that one day, kind of dealing with the soreness for a few days, and then being fine a week later. right? So that's an example of kind of a practical solution using this knowledge that frequency itself doesn't seem to have this reliable independent effect. On the other hand, my lateral delts, and I think a lot of people share this experience, they can just kind of take a beating. They don't really, need all that long to
For sure.
recover. And, again, in general, if you train them with higher frequencies, you're also going to train them with higher volumes. So there's really no downside to training them with higher frequencies and higher volumes. And it kind of works well with the training setup I like to use for myself. And as a result, I do a good amount of volume on them. I do them with high frequencies. And that's, again, kind of a practical solution to getting in the workload that I want based on how my body responds to any given setup or any given stimulus.
Okay. And do you think that your proximity failure impacts what your training frequency should be? Like, do you think there's any correlation if you're leaving more in the bank as opposed to zero RIR or actually going to failure? Like, do you think that there's a recovery aspect that makes it where maybe less training frequency is appropriate?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's probably to some degree a relationship between those two variables in the sense that on average, if you're taking all your sets to failure, past failure, that might necessitate slightly lower frequencies on average. I think it's pretty muscle group dependent, to be honest. Some muscles just seem to get a little bit more beat up and take a little bit longer to recover. So I think proximity to failure is a variable that might play some role. I
Mhm.
think most of your sets for hypertrophy should be all the way to failure or pretty close to it. So I don't really view it as like this massive band of proximity to failure that you're going to hang out in. So that's often not like a primary thing I'm thinking about is like, oh, this person's training far from failure, therefore they're going to train with high frequencies. I'd probably just say, hey, you should train to failure or close to it basically all the time, and then let frequency fall into place after that is taken care of.
Okay. Do you feel like this differs from strength training from a frequency standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. So in that analysis that I mentioned to you, we also did the exact same thing, but looking at strength outcomes, right? So basically, what you can imagine is on the x axis, you have the number of times per week, either the exact lift that you're trying to get stronger at was trained, or the muscles that contribute to the lift you're trying to get stronger on. So that the number of times per week that's trained is on the x axis. Then on the y axis, you can imagine additional strength gains. And long story short here, we did have a pretty convincing improvement in terms of strength gains when going from low frequencies to kind of moderate frequencies. So around 2 to 3 times per week. So if someone's goals are to maximize their 1 rep max on a bench press, a squat, a deadlift, an overhead press, whatever the case may be, I'm going to prioritize frequency a little bit more. Does that mean that we need to train squat every day or even 4 or 5 times a week? Absolutely not. But that is a little bit higher on the priority list, if you will, for the strength athlete compared to someone just interested in physique development.
Okay. And I remember what I was thinking about before. So, in regards to frequency, how do you know if you are training too frequently? Would it be that you're not recovering and progressing? Like, how would you think through that if you're someone who's training, their back 3 times a week?
Yeah.
How do I know if that's too much as an intermediate lifter?
Yeah, that's a great question. To me, I think you need to think about the other things that drive hypertrophy and ensure that frequency isn't taking away from those, right? So let's return to my examples of training my hamstrings with lower frequency, but my lateral delts with higher frequency. The only reason I'm doing that is because it allows me to train with higher volumes than I otherwise would if I were to kind of flip flop those and train harder, right? So again, I mentioned if I were to train my hamstrings with higher frequency 2 or 3 times a week, I would have to train further from failure and probably with lower total volume throughout the week. And we know from research that training volume and proximity to failure seem to have stronger, more reliable, more robust relationships with hypertrophy. So I'm not going to move the chess pieces around the chessboard to try to optimize frequency if it's taken away from those other variables, right? We want to adjust frequency so that it allows you to maximize how hard you're training, how close to failure you're training, and getting sufficient volume in, right? So to directly answer your question, the the way that I would think about it is you are training with too high of a frequency if it's taking away from your ability to execute with a execute a sufficient amount of volume with very high intent, very high effort, and to or close to failure.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm going to move topics here. So I know you started training for sports performance, and then you moved to powerlifting when you hung up your basketball shoes for good. And I think more recently you've moved to hypertrophy training and physique development. So I'd love to know during that shift to hypertrophy, what's something that's gone better than expected and something that's gone worse than expected?
That's a great question. Yeah, I originally got interested in kind of the field, if you will, from a strength perspective, and I'm still very interested in the strength perspective, but less from a personal perspective and more from a coaching and research perspective these days. Whereas I just love lifting weights, and I kind of view hypertrophy training as a right now a mechanism for just enjoying lifting weights. Before it was strength training slash powerlifting, now it's hypertrophy training, and the reason I made that transition is it's quite a bit more flexible, is what I've found. Whereas, I by no means was an elite power lifter, but I had gotten to the point where in order to make meaningful progress on my powerlifting total, it just took a lot of training and it took a lot of headspace and it took a lot of caffeine and just things that were kind of taken away from my things that were just slightly higher priorities. I have one year left in my PhD, so I had to make sure I was taking care of business there. Things in with my company, Data Driven Strength, my coaching clients, the list goes on, and I found myself really wanting to get back to a training approach that was had a slightly more manageable and more flexible footprint on my daily schedule is kind of what it comes down to. Um, you know, if I'm showing up at the gym at 9 o'clock at night, because that's the only time I could squeeze it in, it's a lot more palatable to hop on the leg press and just kind of turn my mind off and try to train as hard as I can and get to failure, as opposed to the exact getting the exact right load on the bar for my top set for a barbell back squat. It's just a little bit more palatable these days for me, and I again can be quite flexible with the workloads that I'm doing. So the way that I have my training set up right now is I always almost always train the exact same number of days per week, but the session duration and the volume of each session is very flexible, right?
Okay.
So sometimes I'll go in and I'll be in and out of there in like 18 minutes because I do one set per exercise. Other times I'll bump that up to 5 or 6 sets per exercise, and I'll really milk that session and be nice and flexible with it and take advantage of those days when I do have a little bit more time and headspace for it. So that's been the main reason. I think you can still take an approach like that for powerlifting. I just think it's a little bit harder. So that has been something that's gone better than expected. It's just the flexibility and enjoyment I've kind of gotten back with training. Something that's been a little bit harder, I think, is kind of related, but it's like a double edged sword in the sense that I really like performance. Like that just gets me fired up. I think some people really like to chase the pump or really like other aspects of training. Maybe it's the pain. I get really fired up about just performance itself. Luckily, I'm able to kind of get that outlet through my clients because I get really excited about how they're performing in the gym, but I do still have that itch kind of myself. So that's something that's been quite challenging, because as psychologically demanding as powerlifting training is, it's also nice that you look forward to the session so much because you're excited about what load you can put on the bar that day. Whereas hypertrophy training, it's a little bit harder to kind of scratch that itch. So that's been tough. But I've found ways to get excited about. I set some goals for myself for this year regarding like a new 10 rep max on RDL, new 10 rep max on hack squat, leg press, things like that to kind of scratch that itch a little bit. But it's been tough because it can be hard to kind of get that same outlet, that same competitive drive that powerlifting kind of gave me.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like on the hypertrophy side, like I messaged my buddies like a few days ago. It's like, hey, I hit like a new 15 rep max on my tricep overhead rope. Like it's exciting to me, but I understand how that's
Yeah.
not as exciting as hitting like a 1 rep deadlift
The
PR, right? So I
feeling
feel
of
like
hitting
you have to change the goals, especially with the isolation exercises, because I feel
Mhm.
um, it is not easy for everyone to really get excited about a 12 rep PR for preacher curl, right? Like even for you,
Totally.
you're mentioning your goals are more on those like still on the compounds. It's
Yeah.
harder to shift that towards the isolations.
And it's funny you say that because I've also shifted. So I like to have what I like to call fingerprint exercises for like each muscle, right? So a fingerprint muscle or two for quads, hamstrings, glutes, chest, back, shoulders, biceps, triceps, right? So put simply, I try to kind of keep the core exercises I do pretty consistent most of the time. And for biceps and triceps, I've moved to exercises that might not be ideal or optimal from the perspective of like, kind of the principles of exercise selection, if you will, for hypertrophy, but I just get excited about and allow me to lift heavier loads. So right now, over the last probably 6 months or so, I've been doing JM press, which
Okay.
for those that aren't familiar, it kind of looks like a close grip bench, but you bring it towards like your chin level or so. Honestly, I don't think it's that great of an exercise for me for my triceps hypertrophy. It kind of beats up my elbows, but I'm excited about trying to do like 150 pounds on that for sets of 10, right? That's exciting to me. And to me, that kind of excitement for training matters a heck of a lot more than slightly more advantageous exercise selection from like a textbook perspective, if you will.
For sure. I think a big part of exercise selection is if you enjoy it and then how practical it is too. Like some of the optimal exercises just there have some contrived setups that are just not I wouldn't say they're not realistic, but if it takes you 10 minutes to set it up at your gym, it may not be worth it as well. But
Totally.
one thing I wanted to touch on there, you mentioned that your session length could, sometimes it could be 18 minutes, sometimes it could be an hour. How do you measure progression if your session from a week to week doesn't look quite the same?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is probably something I've changed my mind on almost completely, like almost a complete 180 in terms of what matters when it comes to prescribing training, assessing the effectiveness of training, and therefore kind of within both of those is the execution of training, right? And I think I've been very, very humbled throughout my research career up to this point about what we can and can't say regarding progression, especially on the individual level. So at the end of the day, a lot of people will use rep progression at a given load or a new load that they use for a number of reps. So, like a 10 rep max, like we were discussing before,
Mhm.
and using that to assess hypertrophy progress. I think those are helpful tools, but I do think it's important to acknowledge that those are by no means the end all be all. We see various examples in the research where you can have strength progression in the absence of hypertrophy. You can also this is less common, but it does seem to also happen in some scenarios where you can have hypertrophy in the absence of strength progression. So, in other words, those two things are not related in a one-to-one sense. They're probably related to some degree, and that's why I still think it's important to set goals like that and to monitor those things. But to me, I'm less worried about beating exactly what I did last week as I am about saying, hey, the best set of 10 of RDLs in 2025 is better than the best set of 10 that I hit for
Sure.
RDLs in
Yeah.
2024. I'm more worried about those high level things. I think on a week to week basis, there's going to be fluctuation. There's going to be some days where I go in there and I feel ready and recovered to train closer to failure, train with higher volumes. And there's going to be other times where I trained a little bit further from failure and maybe even with lower volumes as well. And that just doesn't affect programming. I think of programming from a principle basis, from a training input or a training stimulus basis, as opposed to saying, oh, over January and February, that block that you did in there, you saw a 10% increase in your strength, whereas the block you did after that, you saw a 14% increase in strength. Therefore, the second block was better. I think that you can definitely get lost in the weeds there. And that's why I don't think short term progression is really something we need to stress about all that much. And instead, focus on what sort of setup allows me to be consistent, maximize the quality work under the curve from a long term perspective. Make sure you're keeping a finger on the pulse in terms of those fingerprint exercises I mentioned before. Make sure those are generally moving in the right direction. Make sure every 6 to 12 months you're seeing, ideally multiple PRs on those. And I think the rest kind of takes care of itself. And honestly, again, that's something I've changed my mind on over the last 12 to 18 months, largely as a result of my research experience. That has been very freeing for me, right? It's allowed me to be very flexible with both my training and my clients' training as well.
Yeah, it sounds like you're now optimizing for more adherence, fun, and flexibility, and that's been a little bit liberating.
Yeah, and I would make the argument that that is also optimizing for outcomes, because the alternative that I think some people would vouch for in my situation, like if I were to go to some coaches, right, they might say, okay, if some days you don't have much time, we're just going to program a volume or workouts that are only 30 minutes long. But therefore, I would also run into the situations where I have more time and I could do more volume, I could get more stimulus, but I'm purposefully not taking advantage of that because I'm kind of being held to the lowest common denominator of my schedule. I don't think that makes a lot of sense from a principle perspective. So to me, I'm kind of taking it day by day, week by week in terms of what's available to me and kind of maximizing the stimulus within those constraints. And to me, that's, yes, like you said, maximizing adherence, fun, and flexibility. But I also think it's maximizing my outcomes within the constraints that I have, because the alternative would just be to do less all the time.
Yeah, I think like a good thought exercise is like, why would I fail? That's something I do often. And then that would be like, okay, if what I've set up is too difficult on my worst weeks, that shouldn't be the setup. So have kind of a more moderate setup, but then have the ability to increase on that in weeks where you have more. That way your worst week is still um, generally in the right direction.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think this is pretty goal dependent. Um, like if I had someone with a pretty variable schedule for powerlifting, I probably would lean a little bit more towards like just always giving them a workload they could dominate. That seems to lead to a little bit
Mm.
more reliable performances and steadier progression. Whereas for hypertrophy, if you kind of take care of some other things with the overall training setup, there's some basic education in terms of, hey, don't triple your volume from the week before. You're going to probably wreck yourself. Um, I think hypertrophy is just a little bit more flexible of a goal in that sense. And yeah, I think there should be no shame in getting a little bit in, right? We see that in the research all the time, that a little bit of hard training, progressive training, a little bit goes a long way. And sure, more seems to be better to some degree, but there are diminishing returns with that, right? So each incremental, set that you do is less effective than the one before. So the first set you do is the most effective, and if you can get that first set in consistently, that's really what's going to drive the progress over the years. And that's how I think you should think of training is over years and not months or weeks.
Do you think there's a minimum amount of volume you can do in a session? So if you go in and you hit 3 sets of bicep curls close to failure, is that still a
Mhm.
productive session?
Yeah, I don't think there's any mechanism in terms of how we currently understand hypertrophy that would suggest that you need a certain magnitude of stimulus in order to reach a threshold at which point you grow. I think of it as a very continuous relationship, right? So if you were to just stop training right now and if we're thinking of this hypothetical person as someone that has been training, you're going to see a decrease in muscle mass, right? If they were to start training once every 2 weeks, they're probably still going to lose muscle mass, but they're going to attenuate that rate of loss. So the rate of muscle atrophy or the rate of muscle loss is going to be decreased. So they're going to maintain more of their muscle mass. Now, if they were to train once a week, maybe they are able to maintain what they have gotten. And then if they were to train twice a week, maybe are able to continue to see progress, but it's just less so. And then if they were to kind of work towards an optimal program, that's whatever 4 to 5 times a week. Now they kind of see a really strong increase in terms of the rate of muscle growth. So I view it as very much a continuous relationship in the sense that, a little bit goes a long way. And again, like I mentioned, if anything, the first set or two, that's the most effective. That's the best return on investment. That's the best bang for your buck. So I think a lot of folks that are busy, a lot of folks that love training, but they're trying to juggle other things should not get lost in the trap of I have to do, 4 to 5 sets because that's what this program said.
Mhm.
You could do one set and you could probably see really solid results if you're consistent with that.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to throw out a couple topics. Tell me if you think it's overrated, underrated, or you can do appropriately rated if you'd like, with a
Okay.
little explanation. The first one is intensity techniques.
I'm going to give you an answer. I'm not going to totally dance around this, but I'll just say on the front end, I struggle with this because I spend some time on the internet, but not a ton of time on the internet. So it's hard to understand how well like how what
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the general thinking is on the topic. But from my understanding regarding intensity techniques, I would say overrated. I don't think they should be the bulk of most people's training. I view them largely as the cherry on top.
Okay. Um, do you think that they could be underrated if someone has time constraints?
I think maybe in that case they would be properly rated. I think they can be a really nice tool, like you mentioned, for someone with time constraints. But there are other tools that I would go to first. Um, Probably the easiest one is pairing exercises, right? So this would most people just think of this as a superset. I don't really like the word superset. I just like to say, hey, I'm going to pair these two exercises. So, I mentioned my training setup is very time oriented. I want to maximize my time in the gym. So instead of doing like push pull legs, what I do is I do torso, arms, legs. So that allows me to set up my torso training. So torso, I would consider mostly chest and back, right? Chest and back is very easy to pair exercises with or superset exercises with because the muscles are non-overlapping. Whereas if you were to do a push session, which is chest, shoulders, and triceps, you can't really superset chest and triceps because while
Tricep.
you're resting for your
Yeah.
chest, and then you go train triceps, now your triceps are cooked for the time you go train chest. So I would set things up so that you can pair exercises really easily or superset exercises really easily that are non-overlapping and continue to make sure the bread and butter of the training is supersets. And then sure, you could add in some intensity techniques like drop sets or like myo reps or myo reps are also typically are sometimes called rest pause training. Um, and that again would be the cherry on top. And I would probably say that for the end of sessions.
Okay. Yeah, I do quite a bit of myo reps for lateral delts specifically. I just find it a
Yep.
good way to kind of push intensity and volume across the week.
Yeah, I would save them for those small muscle groups that, what's actually tapping out are the muscles, right? So if you were to try to do myo reps on leg press,
Oh, squats
your
are really
mind is
dead.
tapping out. Yeah, your mind is tapping out. You're huffing and puffing. Like there's just no chance in my mind that those are as good as straight sets for most people. But yeah, lateral delts, biceps, triceps, maybe some back training, maybe some single joint lower body exercises. I think can be a really nice tool in the tool belt. Right now in my program, the only muscle groups that I do myo reps or rest pause training on is lateral delts. So I'm right there with
Okay.
you.
Yeah, yeah. So same thing. Okay. And then
Yep.
this kind of maybe touches on it. Overrated, underrated rest periods.
So I'm going to say underrated. And again, let me add some context because right now the current state of the research is that they increasing your rest periods does not have a massive effect on hypertrophy outcomes. We at Data Driven Strength, my colleague Zach Robinson, he analyzed all the data as well in a continuous fashion, similar to how I talked about how we analyzed frequency. And again, I cannot say here from a scientific perspective that longer rest periods increase muscle growth. I just don't think that's true, though. I think it's a result of having uh, research that is low in quantity and also low in validity in terms of how it applies to the real world. Um, I think there's probably a point of like resting too much, at which point it's like, okay, you don't have to be resting 15 minutes between your sets to be fully 110% recovered. But I do think, especially stronger folks that are more well trained, I think there's a threshold of rest period that is required to bring the psychological intent required for a productive set on the next one. But again, it kind of depends the perspective you're coming at that to start with. But if I were to take the current evidence-based stance from the latest meta-analyses that rest periods don't seem to have a strong effect, I would guess upon further research that would not be the case. I do think there's a threshold of rest periods that is necessary. That's probably increases with training age.
Okay. I'm going to throw out some quotes you said in the past. Give me your first take on it. Okay. First one here is, I think there isn't and there never should have been a volume recommendation range.
So that's probably me trying to get a little bit spicy just for the sake of it. I understand. So I I've always struggled to just give recommendations like from a tangible perspective or a quantifiable perspective, because that's not how I think about training, right? I don't really think about how many sets I'm doing for my biceps per week. I think about it more from like uh like a continuous dose response relationship perspective. So in other words, I think of it as, okay, if I were to do more, what's the sort of benefit I would get, and to what degree are those returns diminishing, right? So in other words, what is the return on investment from each additional set that I'm going to get? And I think if you give a recommended volume range, that is helpful. But I do think that naturally that sound bite of that recommendation is going to be misinterpreted
For sure.
to assume that that is the range of volumes that leads to progress and that is required for optimal progress. So a common volume recommendation is 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. I think that's a totally fine recommendation. Like if you were to interpret it appropriately, I think that's a really good recommendation. But I think a lot of people will misinterpret that naturally to assume that you're not going to get meaningful muscle growth below that, right? But that's just not the case. In fact, around 3 or 4 sets per muscle group per week seems to be sufficient, at least in the research, to elicit measurable hypertrophy progress. Also, you can make the argument that beyond 20 sets, maybe up to around 30 sets per muscle group per week, leads to additional hypertrophy beyond what you would get in that 10 to 20 sets per week range. So to me, it kind of takes options off the table. And instead, as a science communicator, I want to explain the nature of the dose response relationship from the best research that we have, right? So instead of saying 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week, what I would say is that just generally more is better with a smaller and smaller payoff until it starts working against you. So if you were to think through that recommendation, to me, that gives the listener or the client or whatever the tools to make the decision based on what they need, as opposed to pigeonholing them into a range.
Yeah. And I think sometimes less can be warranted. So, for example, for chest, I do 6 hard sets a week right now. Because when I was doing 12 or 15, I was kind of getting some shoulder pain. I wasn't progressing at the same rate, even though I was training twice a week. So I do it once a week, do 6 sets, and then I can see that I'm progressing week to week. Is that optimal? I'm not sure. Am I progressing? Yes. Is that good enough for me? Yes.
Yeah, totally. So I think once you got, basically in the 10 to 20 sets per week range, it was working against you. So one of the most common ways volume can work against you is when there's aches and pains that might derail you further. So I would make the argument you might be doing the highest volume approach for you over the long term. Because if you were to continue with excessive volumes for you, that might necessitate taking 2 or 3 months of very low quality training, or 2 to 3 months off of chest training overall, therefore decreasing your volume, right? So I think of it as, how do I maximize the quality training under the curve from a long-term perspective, while keeping your other values, your other priorities in mind. And I think that's a better way to go out into the training world, if you will, as opposed to saying, this is what you got to do. This is the number sets you got to do.
Yeah, I interviewed Jeff Alberts, and then he was talking about his training volume, and I was almost like, "Wow, that's really low." And he was progressing, and I was like, "Okay, so it's very individualized." Well, Eric Helms was way more volume, and they're on the same team.
Yeah, I think they would be like Jeff would probably be below that 10 to 20
For
range.
sure.
Eric would probably be, at least for some muscles, above that range.
Yeah.
And I think that's been a I think the field is recognizing that better, and recognizing that these are continuous variables and not categorical variables.
Yeah, I don't have to do 52 weeks of squats anymore. It's very exciting.
Hey,
So,
there's where I'll push back. There's where I'll push back. I think you got to do 50 sets of every single muscle every single week, and
yeah,
if you don't like it, then sorry, training isn't for you.
then don't train.
You can
All
just
right.
go start running, train for a marathon. It's
All
not
right,
for
next
you.
one here. One of the biggest mistakes I used to make was not encouraging lifters to spend as much time as possible in a calorie surplus.
Yeah. So I remember that Instagram post. That was probably a few years ago at this point. I still agree with the sentiment there. Um, I think the surplus can and should be very small. And to me, the thing that kind of determines the magnitude of the calorie surplus is more so related to actually making it detectable. I think in theory, like you kind of want the smallest possible surplus. But the issue is, okay, if I'm in such a small surplus that I
30
can't even
calories.
tell, yeah, that I can't even tell that I'm in a surplus after 2 months because there's enough fluctuation from other things like water weight or when you last used the bathroom, so gut content, you can't even tell how much weight you've gained. I think that's where you should bump calories up. So I'm a big fan of very small surpluses, basically as small as can be detectable, um, for as long as possible, and then just cleaning that up with an efficient cut when necessary. And in my experience, that's quite a bit better than the alternative.
Yeah, I think the challenge I see with the communication there is like, you'll see something that's like bulking's dead, don't bulk. And then the recommendation in the video is to bulk, just not to do a dirty bulk. But if you
Yeah,
are watching this content, you probably weren't thinking of doing a dirty bulk anyways. You know what I mean? Like I feel like that's already off the table, the 1500
yeah,
calorie surplus. So if the recommendation is still to bulk, then it should just be like, I don't know if bulking's dead. I don't know if that's the right recommended,
yeah.
if that's the right title.
Yeah, I like I said, I try to spend as little time as possible on the internet, but I am aware that that's kind of like a debate that's going on right now. I would not claim to be an expert in that. That's not where my specific research
Yeah.
is in. But obviously, it's something I need to keep my finger on the pulse of and have uh, recommendations I feel confident in for my clients. Um, but yeah, I just there's obvious scenarios where you literally have to bulk. Like if you take someone that's 16 years old and is 90 pounds soaking wet, of course, in order to maximize their muscular development, they're going to have to gain weight. Um, but I know that's kind of an extreme example, but I think that concept still applies for someone that's been training for 4 or 5 years, right? In order to completely level up as as a lifter in terms of your physique, and yeah, in order to completely level up your physique, I think you're going to have to gain weight. Now the exceptions there is when someone's already weighs a lot and is carrying a lot of body fat. um, but I think that's probably a conversation for another time. But yeah, I would be generally pro bulking, but pro slow bulking, and I think that's kind of what everybody thinks anyway.
Yeah. All right. Next one. I view studies as physiological concepts to draw off of and not practical at all in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I second that now. I agree with previous Josh whenever I said that. I So like if you think of a volume study, of a research study is typically around the length of an academic semester minus a few weeks for logistical reasons, getting people recruited, signed up, etc. Right? And so therefore, most studies are like 8 to 12 weeks on average. So let's just say 10 weeks. It's a much different question for me to say, hey, Varun, go maximize your biceps hypertrophy over the next 10 weeks. That's a much different question than me saying, hey, Varun, go maximize your biceps hypertrophy over the next 10 years and keep yourself feeling good outside of the gym, keep yourself engaged with training, not resenting training, sleeping well, your mood is in a good spot, and all the other positive things that come from lifting or physical activity in general. To me, those are fundamentally different questions, right? So that's another reason, going back to our discussion about specific recommendations, I'm hesitant to give distinct recommendations from these 10-week studies, right?
Okay.
Because of the time scales, they're fundamentally different questions in my mind. And instead, the goal of research is to understand the physiological relationship between an independent variable and the outcome of interest. So the training variable and the outcome of interest, which is generally hypertrophy or strength gain. And then you take that information and kind of, it should go through your practitioner lens, whether you're the lifter or you're the coach, and apply those, right? And that's why, again, you could land on someone like Jeff Alberts doing lower volumes or someone like Eric Helms doing higher volumes. And I think you could make that case, or you could go through that thought process for all training variables. And that's why I'm, like we were joking about the 52 set per week study. A lot of people would say that that's not practical. I agree, right? Like completely, it's not practical at all. But sometimes in research, you go to extremes to see what happens, right?
Okay.
To see, is there eventually a point where it does harm you? Another really good example is stretching before training. Some of the very early stretching studies before training were extreme in nature. So they would be long duration stretching, intense, painful stretching, and it would be right before you get into your working sets, right? Those do show that it decreases performance, right?
Okay.
So that's helpful to know. But then when you look at studies that are more reasonable, so more reasonable durations, more reasonable amounts of pain during the stretching, and a little bit of a break before your working sets, it doesn't seem to really be an issue, right? So that's another good example of like, we want to look at the concepts, we want to look at the directionality, but we're not all that interested, in my mind, in terms of the exact numbers that they use. We're looking for concepts, we're looking for the nature of the relationship, and then we apply that using our practitioner lens.
Okay. So I know you said you're not on the internet all the time, but I'd love to understand, when are you proud of science communication in exercise science, and when do you roll your eyes?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think I try my best to be optimistic, but I do think just by nature I'm a little bit cynical. So I'll start with the latter. I'll start with when I roll my eyes. Um, I roll my eyes a bit when we use individual studies to make flashy content.
Okay.
Let me preface that by saying that like science communication is hard, and you are competing against like non-scientific communicators or people that are trying to maybe purposefully do harm, or maybe there's obviously some gray area there. So it's a difficult game to play with the whole algorithmic world that we live in. So I don't want to make it seem like holier than thou, but if I were to just kind of think of a time where I have rolled my eyes, it's when we take new study results that in our field are small samples, often have many limitations, again, are like 10 weeks long, and we make flashy content and strong claims about it. When I'm proud of it is when we this one's a little bit harder to think about because again, I can be a little bit cynical at times, but I do think from a high level, things are absolutely moving in the right direction. Like I have done the exercise of going back to like science communication, whether it's from myself or from other folks from say 2018 or 2019. And I feel way better about the way that people communicate things now. I think overall, the quality of research that we have and the applicability to fitness is way better now. And I also think the folks communicating it, just average scientific literacy, is way better. So I feel proud about the direction that things are going. I think I won't take any credit for this, but my colleague Zach Robinson, I think he has whether people identify him as like the catalyst for this or not. I think he's been a big part of that because he's published some really impactful work, and I think that's kind of trickled the science communication sphere of thinking about these concepts more from a continuous relationship, like we were talking about before, thinking about it more conceptually, as opposed to kind of viewing, okay, what study's hot off the press and how am I going to change my training this block as a result. I think Zach's been a big part of that, and again, I feel proud about how things are moving from a high level in terms of science communication.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like it is a challenging thing because I understand, like sometimes you won't have to make things slightly clickbait or a little bit flashy. And I know the reasoning behind that. People say, well, it's like, at least we're getting more people in here and then we're providing good information. But the problem is when you're not providing good information because the information that the user is seeing is the flashy stuff. They're not going to watch your long form content because they like the flashy stuff. So I think uh, science communicators in the space that do that need to kind of reflect and say, like, would my younger self be proud of this content? Or like do some sort of thought exercise because um, I do sometimes see that the quality from people decreases over time because they're chasing the algorithm.
Yeah, it's tricky, man. I see both sides of it. Our company, Data Driven Strength, we tend to lean on the conservative side, but we've had thumbnails that I look back at and I'm like, man, like I wish that wasn't the case, but yeah, I don't
So
know, man. It's tough, and I think another really tricky thing is you can have like the flashy title and thumbnail, but actually when you listen to the video, if you listen closely to the way they're speaking and the exact words they're using, it's actually quite scientifically accurate if you were to really interrogate it, right? But like you said, there's kind of a like, to what degree do you put the onus on the consumer? Because like you said, a lot of people make conclusions based on the title and the thumbnail,
well, not
and they
just
don't
that. If it's a
hear.
1 minute short and it's not what you would say in a long form content, but you're making it catchy. So I have no problem actually with the thumbnail and the title because to me that's
Yeah.
like sending an email. You want someone to get in, but once they're in, the content has to be uh, valid and reasonable and not hyperbolic to get attention and views. Like there's a hard part there.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. I'm with you for sure. It's a balancing act that I have. Like I said, I can roll my eyes at it and I can get frustrated at times, but I also have a lot of sympathy if someone has fallen on the wrong side of that, because it's not an easy thing to do. While you are, even if that's coming from someone that is a scientist or has been a scientist in the past, and they get into it for the right reasons. Running a business is hard, and Varun, that as well. Like, if you are relying on this for your livelihood, maybe you even have employees, and that's what is kind of a KPI of what improves the
Yeah.
business. But you also have your fundamental principles. Like, it's hard, and I think it's another just something that's kind of unsolvable. But I think it's good to have conversations about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were talking about kind of, the short-term nature. So I want to put you through a thought exercise. Imagine it's the year 2050 and we have awesome long-term studies for late, intermediate, and advanced lifters. What topics would you want those to cover? Like, what would you want as
Mm.
long-term studies that we can review in the future? Does anything come to
Y-
mind?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, too many things come to mind that I want to try to pick the best one. So I'm honestly a little bit less interested these days in like typical resistance training studies. And when I say a typical resistance training study, I'm thinking of like a volume study or a frequency study or a proximity to failure study or a rest period study. Don't get me wrong, like I'm still very interested in those, but where I think we can really get kind of that next level or that higher level of insight is honestly with longer term studies, and it requires longer term studies. So let me give you a basic example of this. I think the whole natty limit thing can definitely be debated. in the sense of like whether it truly exists, whether it's something that we should even talk about, because it kind of gives this pessimistic feel to someone's long term potential. And it might lead to someone prematurely saying, like, okay, I'm going to stop trying now. I'm going to stop giving it my all because I'm at my netted limit. Whereas most of the time, it's not the case. But I think everyone would be on the same page that there is at least kind of this asymptote, right? That you kind of approach, and there is diminishing returns over time where your gains are less and less robust. And again, something kind of resembling this natty limit. So if we were to think about probably the most common training variable to study, or one of the most discussed training variables of training volume, I'm very curious about how those short-term studies, how those impact reaching that natty limit. So in other words, does volume just get you to that ceiling, get you closer to that natty limit quicker? Or does it actually, are higher volumes actually required to get to your natty limit? Right? I don't know, but I think that is a fundamental question that we just don't know much about, right? Let's say that we had, like you said, it's 2050 and we had unlimited funding and we have a ton of 10-year long studies on this question. And we learned that higher volumes don't actually increase your natty limit. You just get there faster. That's completely changes the game in terms of how we think about training, because now, does that apply for rest periods? Does that apply for all the other variables that might impact hypertrophy? And in that case, again, then it really is just an adherence and consistency thing, and just having some degree of quality with your training and doing it long enough, and you'll get there anyway. So that's where I'm most interested, is some of those higher level questions, and how we approach that kind of asymptote, that natural point where the gains really start to slow down. That's what I'm most interested in these days.
Awesome. All right, I got one more question here. So you mentioned you broke through a 17-inch arm plateau. Can you maybe talk about what tools and methods you used to break through?
Yeah, man. I probably broke through that in like maybe shortly after COVID, like 2021. At the peak of the last bulk, I think I got to 17 and a little over a third. So
Solid.
things have continued to move in the right direction there, though. But it's definitely slow moving. I've found in my, like, just upon reflection of my training, the two most important variables in this order would be exercise selection and then training volume. And when I say exercise selection, I think this kind of is what gets you off the ground, right? Like, if you are using poor exercise execution and poor exercise selection, I kind of think everything else is moot, because it's not even applying the highest quality stimulus you can to the
Yeah.
desired muscles. So, like, another kind of plateau that I've had is quadriceps hypertrophy. Like I mentioned, I'm a taller guy. I have long femurs. Squatting just is not natural for me. And when I was powerlifting, I did a lot of like low bar squatting. I even did some high bar squatting. And sure, my quads grew, but it wasn't all that great. But when I moved to better exercises and even cut my volume down quite a bit, things absolutely accelerated in terms of quad hypertrophy. And that's probably what's grown the most since shifting away from powerlifting type training. So to me, breaking through plateaus has been exercise selection, and then secondly, volume. I have just in hindsight had the best periods of growth when I've trained with higher volumes. So specifically that kind of spurt of progress I had where I got through that 17-inch number. Now, to be clear, that's without a pump for those keeping score at home. Um, when that happened, I was just specializing arms. I
Okay.
was That's probably the only time I've consistently done more than 20 sets per week for both biceps and triceps. Um, so I have benefited quite a bit from specialization phases in the past, which is basically just, hey, I'm going to kind of really crank up the workload for 1 to 3 muscles, make sure those are done first in the session, and make sure I give them a lot of psychological priority as well. That's been quite beneficial for me. I do think it's important to say that those have also coincided with time periods where training is more manageable. Like, I'm more excited to specialize something and train with higher volumes when my workload, my schedule is more manageable, sleep is better, nutrition is better. So it's hard to say exactly what it is, but you know, take it with a grain of salt. But those specialization phases have been helpful for me to
Do
kind
you
of break through
do you
fire.
reduce the volume of, other muscle groups when you're specializing or put them in more of like a maintenance phase, or are you keeping them at the same level and then increasing, like arms for that example?
Yeah, I usually do decrease everything else a bit.
Okay.
Um, it kind of depends. I don't think it's like a zero sum game. Um, for most people. So like some people think in order to specialize, I have to put everything else on maintenance. So if I were to specialize arms, I have to put lower body, chest and back and shoulders on maintenance. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think probably what's going to happen first is your time availability and just how much effort you can give to training on any given day is going to kind of cap you first. But yeah, in the cases that I have done it, I have decreased everything else, but that's largely for practical reasons, not because I think there's only a certain amount of hypertrophy that my body can experience overall in a given period of time.
Okay. And you mentioned you're a taller guy. I think you're like what, 6'3", 6'4", something like that.
Yep.
How do you think about like exercise selection and range of motion just being a taller guy?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a totally different game by any means. I actually like I have I'm thinking of one of my clients in particular that's my height, but he's just built a lot better for squatting specifically. And he can sink into a nice deep squat, no problem. Great quad hypertrophy movement for him. But for me, it's just not the case. I think it's more related to leverages as opposed to height. But it does seem that taller folks on average have slightly different leverages. But anyway, um, I do think there might be an independent effect of distance traveled in a movement in terms of its like overall fatigue. This is a concept that I'm actually borrowing from a powerlifting coach named his name is Steve Denovi, where it is a common occurrence for powerlifting coaches to kind of notice that taller lifters and just lifters with longer ranges of motion in their power lifts have a harder time recovering session to session. They can't handle as high of intensities, as high of volumes. So maybe it's kind of led me to slightly lower volume training, which I would say I identify with on average, um, because it's kind of what I can recover from. But in terms of range of motion, all the principles I think the same are the same. I think it's just can be a little bit harder, right? Like I have to put a lot of effort into. I honestly selected the gym I'm at right now because it has the only leg press in my town that I feel like good on. It just allows the back incline goes low enough that I can get really deep, a ton of knee flexion at the bottom, and my quads. I just feel my quads a ton. Whereas I haven't found another gym with a leg press that clicks like that for me. Whereas if you were to take someone with kind of normal proportions, they wouldn't even think twice about that. They'd be like, "Oh, a leg press, perfect. I'll hop on it." So that it's just a little bit challenging for some folks with weird builds. Um, and but again, I think the principles are still the same.
All right. So I'm going to throw a couple of people on the screen here. Tell me if you something you learned from them or if you have a story. So first one here.
Oh man, my PhD advisor, Mike Zordos. I've learned countless things from him. Um, I don't. I like. There's so many. I mean, I've been working with him since 2020. So going on 5 years now, and yeah, there's so much. I mean, a lot of it goes beyond the X's and O's of training or even research. Right. I think he's uh, been a great example of how to lead a group of people. He's always demonstrated the values that go into research that I that have been an important influence on me and that I want to continue to uphold. Values outside of research as well. He's does a fantastic job of knowing when to push one of his students and when to give them space and let them kind of figure things out on their own. So I've learned so many things just again beyond the X's and O's
Awesome.
from Dr. Zordos. The thing that I just credit him for a ton though is what we mentioned before about not necessarily thinking about research from a exact numbers perspective, but instead from a concepts perspective and from a physiological understanding perspective. That's something he's been saying since as long as I knew who he was, is that researchers is for getting concepts and then integrating those concepts into practice. So, um, yeah, that's what comes to mind, but countless things from him.
All right, next one here.
Oh, Mike T. Mike T is the man. I he was a huge inspiration when we started data driven strength. It's always hard to identify exactly when we started it, but 6, 7 years ago at this point. Yeah, he's a brilliant guy. He's obviously one of the top, arguably the top powerlifting coach in the world. I think he taught me how to, he taught me how to think critically about training and how to, in a lot of ways, question exercise science research and its relevancy to powerlifters, how
Okay.
to use individual level data to inform coaching practices, and the list goes on. But Mike T's the man.
All right, we're gonna finish it off with this here. Tell me if you got a story from this picture here.
Oh, that's funny, man. That is at Ohio State. That's funny. Wow, you dug into the archives, man. That is from Ohio State, probably like 2018. I don't even know, but those are my buddies from Jesse Owens North, which is one of I think 3 gyms at Ohio State, but it had the best powerlifting equipment, and uh, that's where all the powerlifters on campus trained. And I think I was doing a set of RDLs there. It was I think the last day of the semester. Some of these guys, maybe even myself, was going to graduate, so we got a picture together, and that's directly to my left in that picture. That's Zach, who's my business
Yeah.
partner now, and some of my other friends, a couple of which I'm still in contact with. So yeah, that's from the Ohio State days where I did my bachelor's degree.
Awesome. Josh, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Where can everyone find you?
Hey, I'm very impressed with your questions and thinking through the background. So I appreciate that. This was entertaining for me because it wasn't the same old questions. So thank you very much for having me on. It's an honor. In terms of where you can find me, you can probably the easiest place is just to go to my Instagram and look at the links there. My Instagram is josh.datadrivenstrength. And I think you can find the rest from there. But again, thank you so much for having me on.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.